1 March 1954 Rongelap Atoll Weather Station, Marshall Islands. A continuously recording dosimeter sat in the instrument shelter, designed to track background radiation in a place where none was expected. Shortly after 6:45 local time, the trace on the paper chart began to climb first steadily, then sharply. Within minutes, the needle reached 100 millirem per hour and kept moving. The instrument went off scale. Operators expected routine monitoring. The perimeter instruments recorded levels that forced evacuation planning by midday. Planners had bounded the test with safety sectors, weather forecasts, and a yield estimate near 6 megatons. The shot delivered 15. Fallout arrived on inhabited atolls hours later, visible as white ash on skin and clothing. This is the documented story of how a single nuclear test exceeded every prediction and how the measurements, minute by minute, dictated a response no one had fully prepared for. February 1954, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands, United States Pacific Proving Grounds. A planning table under fluorescent light. Shot schedules lay open beside instrument deployment maps and hazard sector diagrams. The test series carried the name Operation Castle, and within it, Shot Bravo stood first on the calendar. The device waited on a steel platform at the reef's edge, codenamed Shrimp, a compact thermonuclear design built around lithium deuteride fuel. The goal was validation, prove that a deliverable hydrogen bomb could be mass-produced for the strategic arsenal. The Atomic Energy Commission held civilian control over United States nuclear testing. Joint Task Force 7 executed operations in the field. Diagnostics teams prepared high-speed cameras, pressure gauges, and radiochemistry samplers. Every instrument served the same function: convert the explosion into data that weapons designers could certify. The baseline expectation for Bravo, as summarized in later technical reviews, placed yield near 4 to 6 megatons. Large, but not unprecedented. Safety planning assumed that meteorology, exclusion zones, and sector controls could manage downwind risk. Fallout would behave as a predictable phenomenon bounded by maps, limited by distance, controllable through procedure. The contrast that structures this story begins here. A planning model depends on accurate inputs: yield, wind direction, particle formation, and decay rates. If the source term is wrong, if the explosion produces more energy or different debris than expected, the map becomes fiction. The institutional framework adds another layer. The Marshall Islands operated under United States trusteeship, a United Nations mandate that carried explicit obligations. Documents prepared for the Trusteeship Council emphasize the duty to protect the health of the inhabitants. A weapons program and a treaty obligation now shared the same geography. The first tension is structural. Confidence in containment depends on assumptions that have not yet been tested at this scale. Within days, survey readings would force the question: what happens when the model fails and the measurements cannot be ignored? Late February to 1 March 1954 Bikini Atoll Operations Center, Marshall Islands. Weather updates arrived on a timeline. Wind direction and atmospheric stability were treated as go or no-go criteria. Forecasts predicted conditions that would carry the radioactive cloud away from inhabited areas and out over open ocean. The decision to proceed rested on those predictions. Accounts from the period note a complication. Winds evaluated as favorable in the days before the shot were later described as problematic near shot time, yet the test proceeded. The decision reflects a system under schedule pressure. Delay meant logistical cost, political visibility, and a cascade of rescheduling across the test series. Major General Percy Clarkson, named in documentation tied to the operation, held decision authority in the chain that ordered detonation. The shot was authorized despite late concerns about wind behavior. The operational logic was clear: exclusion zones protected against blast and immediate thermal hazard. Fallout hazard, however, depended on two variables: wind transport and particle characteristics. Both were treated as predictable enough to manage. The planning framework assumed bounded risk. Downwind atolls Rongelap, Ailing-Jinay, Utirik were inhabited. No broad precautionary relocations preceded Bravo. The contrast is documentary. Inhabited communities remained in place while a 15-megaton explosion was prepared upwind. Dose rate fields are measurable even before full-dose reconstructions exist. That principle would soon matter. Once fallout began to deposit, Instruments would generate numbers that demanded immediate response. The question was whether the response could be faster than the dose accumulation. One documented detail stands out. United States weather personnel stationed on Rongelap Atoll, closer to the test site, received shelter-in-place instructions before the shot. Marshallese residents on nearby atolls did not. The disparity is procedural, not dramatic, but it marks a fault line in the system. Protection was not distributed equally. The plan assumed a controllable plume. The instrument network would soon test that assumption in real time. Physics would produce the outcome. The response would be driven not by intent, but by monitors. The clock moved toward detonation. The model's accuracy would be judged not in briefings, but in millirem per hour. 1 March 1954, hours before 6:45 Bikini Atoll, shot Bravo Ground Zero area. Final countdown posture. The shot cab sat on the reef, surrounded by diagnostic installations and connected by cable to the control bunker. Exclusion zones were enforced at sea and in the air. Aircraft and ships held position outside the predicted hazard perimeter. Checklists moved down the page. Weather stations called in wind data. The confidence implied by an expected yield guided every preparation. The documentary contrast becomes explicit here. A test expected at approximately 4 to 6 megatons was treated as operationally manageable. The actual yield reached 15 megatons, not a rounding error, a factor that expanded fallout production, cloud dynamics, and geographic reach. Why did the estimate fail? The answer lies in nuclear physics at megaton scale. The device used lithium deuteride as fusion fuel. Lithium occurs naturally in 2 isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. Lithium-6 was known to contribute to fusion yield through neutron reactions. Lithium-7 was considered largely inert under the neutron flux conditions expected in a thermonuclear explosion. The assumption was wrong. Fast neutrons from the primary fission stage reacted with lithium-7, producing additional tritium and amplifying both fusion and fission pathways. The result was a yield far beyond prediction. The numbers matter because they determine everything downstream. A 6-megaton explosion produces a certain volume of radioactive debris, lofts it to a certain altitude, and disperses it across a calculable area. A 15-megaton explosion changes all 3 variables. More energy excavates more coral and reef material. A larger fireball entrains more particulate. The cloud rises higher and carries more activated mass. Planners believed that wind direction and exclusion zones provided sufficient control. The belief rested on prior test experience and a conviction that fallout sectors could be bounded by operational boundaries. But prior tests had not produced a 15-megaton yield from a misjudged fuel reaction. The next minute began the irreversible chain: detonation, cloud formation, coral uptake, atmospheric transport, and deposition. The clock was about to move from planning time to measurement time. Measurement does not negotiate. 1 March 1954, 6:45 local time, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. The first instrumented second. Fireball formation and diagnostic capture. Within seconds, the thermal pulse and shockwave exceeded what planners had calculated for the estimated yield. Instruments recorded the discrepancy immediately. The explosion was larger. The numbers define the documentary spine. 15 megatons actual versus approximately 6 megatons predicted. Some summaries place the estimate at 4 to 6 megatons. Others describe a design expectation closer to 6. Either way, the outcome was 2.5 to nearly 4 times larger than anticipated. The yield increase linked directly to one technical consequence. More energy and more activated debris mass increased the radiological source term. A larger explosion excavated more material from the reef, pulverized more coral, and lofted more contaminated particulate into the atmosphere. The probability of long-range deposition increased with yield. The measurement systems became the key characters in this phase of the story. Cameras, radiation samplers, and field monitors began generating data that would dictate evacuation decisions within hours. The human actors, test personnel, survey teams, and later medical observers responded to what the instruments reported. The mechanism is documented. The yield increase resulted from unanticipated reactions involving lithium-7. Under intense neutron flux, lithium-7 nuclei absorbed fast neutrons, producing tritium and additional reaction pathways that amplified both fusion and fission contributions to the total yield. This was not sabotage or miscalculation in the conventional sense. It was incomplete understanding of nuclear fuel behavior under extreme conditions. Atomic Energy Commission Chair Lewis Strauss later stated publicly that the yield was about double that of the calculated estimate. The documented yield, however, was closer to 2.5 to 3 times the estimate, depending on which baseline is used. The discrepancy between public framing and technical reality becomes relevant in later chapters. The detonation was over in an instant. The fallout hazard began as the cloud started to ingest the reef. A column of vaporized coral, seawater, and fission products rose into the stratosphere, carrying the radiological signature of the test downwind. 1 March 1954, minutes to hours after detonation, Bikini Atoll and downwind corridor. Field operations teams tracked cloud behavior in real time. Sampling aircraft flew through the plume at measured altitudes, collecting particulate on filter cassettes. Monitors recorded cloud rise, dispersion direction, and the formation of debris from sand, coral, and seawater drawn into the fireball column. The expectation embedded in planning was that fallout would remain largely controllable within declared sectors. The reality diverged. The cloud lofted material high enough to expand geographic reach and produced particulate fallout that could deposit on inhabited atolls within hours. Retrospective technical summaries place the cloud top at approximately 40 kilometers, 130,000 feet, into the atmosphere. The key physical pathway became measurable quickly. Coral dust acted as a carrier matrix for fission products. When particulate settled on skin, clothing, and structures, it created multiple dose pathways. External gamma radiation from deposited material contributed whole-body dose. Beta-emitting particles adhering to skin produced localized radiation burns. Ingestion and inhalation pathways opened when contaminated material entered water supplies and food. Medical and monitoring teams later described visible fallout. One phrase appears in multiple reports: the material had the appearance of snow. The comparison was not poetic, it was observational. White or grayish particulate accumulated on surfaces, distinguishable from natural ash or dust by its texture and the radiation it emitted. The transition from abstract hazard to physical phenomenon occurred within hours. Fallout was no longer a sector on a map. It was a distributed source term on people and infrastructure. Dose rate became a function of deposition density, radioactive decay, and time spent outdoors without shielding. The documentary detail that anchors this chapter is simple. Once fallout is particulate and depositing, the response becomes a race between evacuation and dose accumulation. Every hour, people remained in contaminated areas added measurable exposure. Monitors could calculate approximate dose from field intensities and decay curves. The question was whether evacuation logistics could outpace the physics. The next chapter shows what happened when the phenomenon described as snow arrived on inhabited atolls with recorded populations. 1 to 3 March 1954, Rongelap Atoll, Marshall Islands. Clinical observations began as complaints: itching, eye irritation, nausea recorded in the early hours after fallout arrival. These symptoms were later documented in the medical effects program known as Project 4.1, the formal investigation into radiation injuries resulting from Bravo. The expectation embedded in test planning was that inhabited atolls were protected by distance and operational sectors. The reality is quantified in the project's early summary. 64 people were on Rongelap Atoll during and after the shot. They received approximately 175 roentgens of exposure, a legacy unit measuring radiation exposure in air. For gamma radiation absorbed in tissue, 175 roentgens translates roughly to 1 to 2 gray, or 1 to 2 sieverts, depending on conversion factors and tissue sensitivity. The order of magnitude matters. This is acute exposure sufficient to produce measurable biological effects. The documented outcomes define the medical record. Epilation hair loss appeared within weeks. Hyperpigmented skin lesions developed in areas where fallout particles contacted skin directly. Desquamation, shedding of the outer skin layer, followed in some cases. Hematologic changes included depression of white blood cell counts and platelet levels, consistent with radiation-induced bone marrow suppression. Dose pathways are traceable. Deposited beta-emitting particles produced localized skin dose, particularly on the scalp, neck, and shoulders where particulate accumulated. Gamma radiation from ground deposition contributed whole-body dose. Ingestion and inhalation became concerns when contaminated water and food were consumed before surveys could identify hazards. The medical team's work provides the evidentiary basis for later dose reconstructions. Clinical observations, timing of symptom onset, severity of lesions, laboratory values became biological markers of exposure. These markers allowed dose estimates to be refined and compared against instrument-based calculations. One documented detail stands out. Fallout was distinctly visible on Rongelap. Residents described white ash accumulating on skin and clothing. Children played in it before its nature was understood. The gap between deposition and recognition created a window during which dose accumulated without protective action. Visible fallout, measured dose, documented injury. The chain is complete and evidenced. The next chapter introduces a complication. Some atolls reported dose without seeing snow. 1 to 4, March 1954, Alingine and Bikini Atolls, Marshall Islands. Survey teams and dose reconstruction efforts compared islands with different deposition levels. The results revealed spatial and operational complexity. Alingine residents received approximately 69 roentgens. Bikini residents received approximately 14 roentgens. Yet Project 4.1 states clearly, no fallout was observed on Bikini. The contrast is documentary and important. Dose does not require visible deposition. Low-level fallout can arrive as fine particulate, undetectable by eye but measurable by instruments. The difference between 69 roentgens and 14 roentgens is significant. It marks the boundary between acute injury and subclinical exposure, but both represent contamination events. The clinical record supports the physics. Skin lesions characteristic of beta radiation exposure appeared in Rongelap and Alingine populations. They did not appear in the Bikini group. The absence of visible fallout on Bikini correlates with lower dose and no acute skin injury, but it does not mean the atoll was unaffected. The physics of patchiness is straightforward. Particle size distribution, plume altitude, wind shear, and local precipitation or settling patterns produce hotspots and relatively clean zones within the same general fallout corridor. Large particles settle quickly and close to ground zero. Fine particles remain aloft longer and travel farther, producing lower but more widespread contamination. Survey teams faced decision uncertainty. Who to evacuate first? How to prioritize limited transport and medical resources? How long could people remain in place before the exposure scale became clear? The patchiness of deposition complicated triage. The documented clinical contrast is clean. Rongelap and Alingine populations showed acute effects. Bikini did not. That distinction guided medical monitoring priorities in the weeks and months that followed, but it also created a binary that oversimplified the exposure picture. 14 roentgens is not negligible. It is measurable and relevant for long-term health tracking, even if it falls below the threshold for visible acute injury. The story now moves offshore. The next documentation-driven pivot introduces a vessel outside the announced danger area, a contamination event that becomes the incident's global trigger and converts a Pacific test into an international political crisis. 1 March 1954, Western Pacific Ocean, east of the Marshall Islands. The operational detail is simple and documented. A Japanese tuna fishing boat, Daigo Fukuryu Maru Lucky Dragon No. 5, operated in international waters with a crew of 23. The vessel was contaminated by Bravo fallout hours after detonation. The United States had declared a danger area intended to exclude observers and manage radiological hazard offshore. Documentation and later summaries confirm that Lucky Dragon was outside that declared zone. Yet radioactive ash arrived. The boundary drawn on a chart did not bound atmospheric transport. The contrast becomes an evidence-based turning point. Exclusion zones fail when plume behavior exceeds predictions. The crew experienced acute contamination. Ash fell on the deck, the rigging, and the men themselves. Initial symptoms included nausea, fatigue, and skin burns. The vessel returned to its home port of Yaizu, Japan, on 14 March 1954. Medical examinations confirmed radiation exposure. Blood counts showed depression of white cells and platelets consistent with acute radiation syndrome. The chief radioman, Kuboyama Aikichi, became the incident's focal point. He died on 23 September 1954 from complications attributed to radiation sickness. His death is documented and dated. It marks the only confirmed immediate fatality among civilians exposed to Bravo fallout. The contaminated catch added a second layer of crisis. Fish from the vessel were found to carry measurable radioactivity. Fear spread through Japanese fish markets and the broader public. The phrase "Shinohai death ash" entered public discourse. The contamination of a food supply turned a remote Pacific test into a tangible domestic concern for millions. The political impact was immediate and international. The Lucky Dragon incident could not be managed as a localized technical problem. It involved a foreign vessel, a recorded death, and proof that fallout traveled across open ocean regardless of declared boundaries. The incident forced public acknowledgement that atmospheric nuclear tests had transboundary consequences. Within weeks, United States officials would publicly deny that anything was out of control. Yet evacuation records, medical files, and the Lucky Dragon case remained irreducible evidence. The measurements could not be revised away. 2 to 4 March 1954, Rongelap, Ailinganai, Utirik, transport to Kwajalein Naval Station. Dosimetry drove the response. Project 4.1 documentation describes emergency surveys and measurable radiation fields. The recording dosimeter on Rongelap went off-scale at approximately 100 mrem per hour shortly after detonation. That reading forced immediate action. Evacuation to Kwajalein Naval Station was promptly carried out. The phrase off-scale carries operational meaning. Instruments have measurement ranges. When a reading exceeds that range, the instrument can no longer quantify the hazard. It can only confirm that the hazard is larger than the instrument was designed to measure. An off-scale reading at 100 mrem per hour signals that actual dose rates were higher, possibly much higher. A procedural contrast emerges in the documentation. United States weathermen stationed on Rongelap received shelter-in-place instructions before the shot. Marshallese residents on nearby atolls did not receive equivalent warnings before fallout arrival. The disparity is documented in later accounts and reflects a system where protection was not uniformly distributed. Dose assessment in the field is straightforward in principle, but complicated by logistics. Dose rate measurements at specific locations, combined with decay curves and estimates of time spent outdoors, produce a reconstructed dose. Project 4.1 explicitly states that doses were calculated from measured intensities and an assumed decay exponent. The operational challenge is time. Once fallout has deposited, every hour people remain in the contaminated area adds dose. Evacuation becomes a dose management operation. The earliest possible evacuation still carries a non-zero dose cost because deposition occurred before transport could be arranged. Survey teams recorded dose rates across multiple atolls. The readings varied by location and time, reflecting the patchiness of fallout deposition and the decay of short-lived isotopes. The data fed into triage decisions. Which populations faced the highest exposure and required immediate removal versus which could wait for follow-on transport. The decisive operational fact is this. Once monitors reported off-scale readings, the incident transitioned from test operations to field consequence management. Authority shifted from shot directors to medical and logistics coordinators. The response was governed not by intent, but by mrem per hour. The next chapter examines the collision between measurement-driven reality and public messaging. 31 March 1954, Washington District of Columbia, Eisenhower Administration Press Conference. A transcript on a desk. Questions about megatonnage, blast area, and effects. The press conference record documents the first major public accounting of Bravo. Global concern had already begun. Japanese markets worried about contaminated fish. International observers questioned the safety of Pacific testing. Atomic Energy Commission Chair Lewis Strauss addressed the press. His statements are documented. He described the blast as large enough to take out a city. He also denied that anything was out of control. The phrasing is significant. It reframes the incident as manageable and anticipated, even as operational records documented evacuations, off-scale instruments, and acute injuries. The contrast is textual and documented. Public messaging emphasized control, remoteness, and rapid response. The measurement record contained evacuation counts, recorded symptoms, and dose rate data that implied a system responding to unanticipated conditions. The divergence between rhetoric and measurement shaped international response and long-term trust in radiological communication. The diplomatic context adds depth. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, referenced in National Security Archive summaries, expressed concern about panic and the international implications of contaminated food supplies. The administration faced pressure to defend the testing program while managing allied relationships and public perception. One documented statement from the press conference stands out. Strauss characterized the yield increase as a factor of approximately 2, about double. The technical record, however, places actual yield at 15 megatons versus an estimate of 4 to 6 megatons, a factor closer to 2.5 to nearly 4. The public framing softened the numerical discrepancy. Rhetoric shapes perception, but it does not revise instrument data. Evacuation happened because monitors recorded dose rates that demanded action. Injuries appeared because fallout deposited on skin and in water supplies. The Lucky Dragon crew experienced contamination because the plume traveled beyond declared boundaries. These facts existed independently of how they were described. The next chapter returns to measurement. While officials attempted damage control in Washington, medical files on Kwajalein began recording a pattern that only particulate fallout could explain. Skin lesions distributed by contamination pathways, blood count changes consistent with radiation exposure, and clinical timelines that matched the physics of deposition and decay. March to May 1954, Kwajalein Naval Station Medical Facility, Marshall Islands. Clinical tables replaced press conferences, blood counts, lesion descriptions, biopsy notes. The medical documentation presents findings in technical language stripped of narrative cushioning. The record shows what happened to human tissue when exposed to particulate fallout. Early symptoms appeared within hours to days: itching and burning sensations in eyes and on skin, nausea in some individuals. These are prodromal signs, early indicators of radiation exposure. The symptoms resolved temporarily, consistent with the latent phase of acute radiation syndrome. Later findings were more specific. Epilation began within 2 to 3 weeks. Hair loss occurred primarily on the scalp and areas of high fallout contact. Skin lesions appeared as hyperpigmented patches, areas of desquamation, and in some cases transepidermal necrosis, death of the outermost skin layer confirmed by biopsy. The distribution pattern was diagnostic: greatest severity on the scalp, neck, and shoulders, where particulate accumulation was highest. Hematologic effects provided quantitative markers. Lymphocyte counts dropped within days. Neutrophil counts reached minimum values approximately 3 to 4 weeks post-exposure. Platelet counts decreased progressively, reaching a minimum around 4 to 6 weeks. The timing of these minima acts as a biological clock matching the exposure chronology. Project 4.1 documented these findings across exposed populations. The report enumerates groups: 64 on Rongelap, 18 on Alinginai, 159 on Utiric, accounting for variations in some summaries, and 28 United States personnel on Rongerik. The clinical data were stratified by estimated dose. The report's tone is careful. It acknowledges acute effects while framing long-term risk cautiously. Later, addenda and follow-up studies refined dose estimates and documented internal contamination pathways, primarily iodine, 131 uptake in thyroid tissue, that were not fully characterized in the immediate aftermath. The measurement chain is complete. Field dose rate intensities fed dose reconstructions. Dose reconstructions predicted injury thresholds. Clinical findings confirmed those predictions. The documentation converts fallout from an abstract radiological term into a measurable, biologically consequential event. The story now moves beyond March 1954. The question shifts from exposure to governance, displacement, return decisions, monitoring programs, and the long-term dose accounting burden that Bravo imposed on both governments and populations. Mid-1954 onward, Majuro Atoll and Utiric resettlement, Rongelap relocation planning. Evacuation created displacement. Utiric residents were moved back to their original homes after close medical observation. Rongelap residents were housed temporarily on Majuro with stated plans for eventual return. The language in documentation is procedural. Temporary, constant surveillance, close observation. The long-run significance is that resettlement became governed by radioactive decay, continued monitoring, and political acceptability, not by a clean technical endpoint. The concept of constant surveillance had measurable content. Serial blood counts tracked hematologic recovery. Contamination checks verified that personal effects and living areas met safety thresholds. Dose assessment methods evolved as scientific understanding of internal contamination pathways improved. Thyroid monitoring became a priority after iodine-131 uptake was recognized as a significant contributor to dose. Return decisions were contested. Decay reduced ambient dose rates over months and years, but contamination was not uniform. Hotspots persisted where fallout had concentrated. Root crops and water supplies required testing. The question was not only, is it safe, but safe enough, compared to what alternatives? The administrative burden fell on multiple institutions. The Atomic Energy Commission maintained oversight of radiological safety. The United States Navy provided logistics and transport. Medical teams conducted follow-up examinations and epidemiological studies that extended across decades. The Trust Territory Administration managed housing and supplies. The pattern established by Bravo became a template. Monitor, justify, relocate, monitor again. Uncertainty carried forward as a governance burden. Each decision point required balancing radiological risk against social, economic, and political factors. The technical measurements provided necessary input, but they did not determine outcomes alone. Later chapters in the Marshall Islands' history included additional relocations, disputes over dose reconstructions, and compensation negotiations that stretched into the 21st century. Bravo was not the only test conducted in the Pacific Proving Grounds. It was, however, the most visible failure of the planning model, the test that proved fallout could not be locally contained. The final chapter examines what Bravo changed in the global system: policy, credibility, and the understood reach of atmospheric test fallout. The story moves from one atoll in March 1954 to a treaty signed in Moscow nearly a decade later. 5 August to 10 October 1000. 963 Moscow, Washington, London. Treaty enters into force. Policy as documentation. The treaty text and ratification timeline mark the endpoint of a process that began, in part, with the measurements recorded in March 1954. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, also known as the Partial Test Ban Treaty, prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Underground testing remained permissible, provided it did not cause radioactive debris to cross national borders. The expectation of the early thermonuclear era was that testing could be managed as a national security technical program. Atmospheric tests were faster, cheaper, and provided more diagnostic data than underground shots. The reality, amplified by Bravo's documented fallout impacts and international backlash, pushed negotiators toward restricting the medium of testing itself. Bravo became a reference point in public and diplomatic discourse about test hazards. The Lucky Dragon incident gave fallout a name, a face, and a death certificate. The evacuation of Marshallese populations and the documented injuries provided evidence that civilians far from test sites faced real risk. The measurements, dose rates, contamination levels, clinical findings could not be dismissed as theoretical or propagandistic. The treaty signatories were the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. These 3 nations held the largest arsenals and the most extensive testing programs. The treaty did not end nuclear testing. It shifted testing underground, where containment could be verified and transboundary contamination minimized. Over 100 nations eventually signed the treaty, though some nuclear-armed states did not. The system's lesson is clear. Atmospheric tests are not locally containable because transport is global scale. Fallout from high-yield detonations enters the stratosphere, where it disperses across hemispheres. Deposition occurs thousands of kilometers from the test site. Global dispersion and deposition are scientifically describable and measurable. Policy reacted to that measurability. Bravo's measurements, dose rates, evacuation records, clinical findings, and the Lucky Dragon incident became evidence that redefined acceptable testing practice. The treaty is the documented policy response to that reality. A single test projected radiological consequences beyond declared zones and beyond national borders. The treaty acknowledged that fact and restricted the activity that produced it. Castle Bravo demonstrated that atmospheric nuclear testing carried consequences that maps and forecasts could not bound. The instrument that went off scale on 1 March 1954 marked the beginning of a measurement-driven response. The clinical records, evacuation logs, and diplomatic files that followed marked the end of the assumption that fallout could be treated as a localized, manageable phenomenon. The test forced a question into the open. What happens when a single weapon test produces transboundary contamination, documentable injuries, and an international incident? The answer appeared 9 years later in Moscow. The Limited Test Ban Treaty remains in force. It stands as policy built on measurement, on dose rates recorded in millirem per hour, on lesions documented in medical logs, and on ash that fell where no boundary line could stop it.